I run a research group which focuses almost exclusively on open source software engineering. So you've probably seen this slogan, software is eating the world. What's meant by that is some form or another. So it's super important to understand how the software industry influences your own products and your own industry if it's not the software industry. We previously heard how open source empowers sharing, how it brings out the best in people. My talk is different. I will focus exclusively on economics. I take, if you will, a hard-nosed perspective on this, how things are working out from an economic perspective and what it means in particular for industries or countries that are not leaders in the IT industry. For my examples, I will have to simplify. Imagine you're producing a product or a service which has and for that simplification, there's exactly one component, external component you need, a software component. And then you add to that your own product or service. So here, for example, if you're a taxi driver, you're providing a ride. That's the service you're providing to your customers. But with Uber, there's the facilitation of finding that customer. So there's a software component provided by Uber, a service you depend on, and then there's the service you provide. If you're selling TVs, there's a lot of software in the TVs. You may think you're manufacturing the hardware, but you really only have a superior product if the software is right as well. So it's always the combination of a component that's being supplied to you, on which you depend, and then something you add to it to make your whole product. Now, what about pricing and who makes what money? It really depends on the power of the different component in your product. If the software component you depend on is provided to you by a monopolist, they will keep raising their prices until you sell at cost, meaning your revenues match your costs and there will be no profits left for you. All the profit goes to the provider of that component, software component that you depend on. The taxi drivers are clearly seeing that, as Uber, for example, is in a strong position. Maybe with the TVs, it's not quite like that yet. So if you are facing a monopolist in your supply chain, if you need a software component to provide your product or service to a market, and you're dependent on that software component and it's owned by a monopolist, you're not in a good position. It's a bit better if there are alternatives, but if these are closed source software alternatives, you're still locked in to that component in a way that you have to stay with that one supplier or face high switching costs, so that vendor lock-in gives that software supplier a strong negotiation position to raise their prices or keep their prices high as well. So no surprise here, the countries who do this game, who are best at this game, is the United States. Most of the rich software companies who benefit from these situations, and in particular strong monopolies or near monopolies, are American companies. And so it's an important game to understand and play, again, because software will be in every product and every service. Now, the interesting thing historically is that those who suffered this problem first was the software industry itself. Software is also built from components, and the first obvious monopoly of relevance here, or near monopoly, was Microsoft Windows. So at the expense of Intel and Hewlett-Packard and SAP and Oracle, Microsoft was earning superior profits in the market. In return, it's only the software industry, interestingly, the software industry invented a method of fighting against these monopolies by adopting open source practices. So after IBM's OS2 failed, an attempt to provide a competing operating system to Microsoft Windows, these companies realized no single company alone can fight Microsoft, and they joined forces to support the development of Linux. Linux, as an operating system, has become a viable alternative to Windows. Not only did they join forces, they did so in a structured way, which is the main message of my talk today. They did so in a structured way by setting up an open source foundation, which is a place of good governance that ensures as conflict-free as possible collaboration towards a joint goal, with the consequence of the output being community open source software. So the software industry experienced this tool or method of fighting back monopolists in the 90s by setting up Linux against Windows or setting up the Linux Foundation against Microsoft. They repeated that play in the early 2000s when Microsoft again was about to dominate the developer tools market, and the developer tools and developer mindset is at the root of much application success. So that was an important market. And they did, and IBM led it this time, and they succeeded by creating the Eclipse Foundation in opposition to Microsoft and Microsoft's Visual Studio. It happened a third time recently. This time, more recently, it's not Microsoft any longer who's the bad guy, but rather it's Amazon Web Services. So the industry came together and created the OpenStack Foundation to fight back the budding monopoly of Amazon Web Services, who is setting out to rule the world. Somehow this tool here doesn't like my button pressing. Okay, so back. So open source is obviously behind that. The question is, how do you do it? Most people focus on the legal aspects, how software becomes open source software that has an open source license, which ignores the other important part, which is open source is also a collaboration process. Open source has not only invented these interesting licenses, it also has invented a way of how to collaboratively develop software and be successful at that. Developing software and succeeding is really hard. IBM failed at creating an operating system to compete with Windows. The open source world succeeded where IBM, a well-established, well-working company, failed. So the open source collaboration model is a way of getting to successful software. Not always, but much more likely than if you just start with nothing. So open source is not only a license or a legal tool, it's also a collaboration process. And for these companies of the software industry still, in order to throw their resources together and compete with the potential monopolists they wanted to fight, they needed more than just licenses and a way of collaboration. They needed an organization. They needed a structure with governance, a structure where you could settle conflicts of interest, a structure that could fiscally accept donations, that could channel sponsorship, that could channel money in a clean and correct way. So they needed to create a non-profit organization called Open Source Foundations here. The Linux Foundation is an example. The Eclipse Foundation, OpenStack, and many others are all examples of open source foundations. The purpose of an open source foundation is to sponsor, manage, and possibly also develop the software of interest to the members of that organization. The economic benefits I mentioned in the beginning already are now a bit more structured, perhaps. If you are able to replace a component owned by a monopolist in your product or solution by a cheaper open source alternative, you free up what's called you free up parts of the wallet of your customers. you can acquire a larger share of wallet of what your customer has money to spend on, meaning you can potentially have higher profits because there are added revenues that will accrue to you and not to the monopolist in your product components. The second, there are other benefits. For example, if you can lower the total cost of a product. In software, at least, there's a lot of price discrimination possible. You can customize your products in such a way that you can charge different customers different prices. And as a consequence, with this added pricing power or lower cost leading to higher pricing power, you can actually reach more price-sensitive customers. You simply increase the number of customers you can pay to. Not at the profit as the old customer, at the same profit, but still at a profit. And finally, you can increase the total addressable market size that of the market you're selling into, because if everyone builds on those components, in particular if they are platforms, then you will simply have more customers be compatible with that. If you move your data center to if you get more people to use Linux and have the data centers run on Linux, and you sell into Linux shops, then this way you can address your total market size. Now, to explain what happened historically, how the software industry invented a way of fighting monopolists and preventing the flow of all profits to them, I focus on the software industry. There's nothing that restricts this to software. In fact, we have seen over the last 10, 15 years the rise of open source foundations driven by users of software. The three examples I gave you so far, the Linux Foundation, Eclipse, OpenStack, are vendor-led or, on the left side, developer foundations, meaning these are managed, motivated, run by the software industry itself. Software companies are fighting back a monopolist from their own. Now, there are today examples coming up in the next slide. Open source foundations created by companies in very different businesses, in healthcare, in energy, in automotive, with the goal of sponsoring and managing the development of the software they need in the form of open source software. I call them user-led foundations, meaning the users are leading the foundation. They're also paying for it, but they're leading the strategy and what the requirements and what the features of the software are in order to meet their own needs. There's a further differentiation. Some of these user foundations only sponsor, meaning they only pay. Some are also engaged in the actual development, meaning some of these companies, for example, the automotive companies, some of the railway companies in Germany, they actually have development capabilities. So they have developers, they don't only pay money, they also invest by having developer resources contribute to the open source projects. So I want to look now at user-led open source foundations, where users are in the driver's seat and are determining what the software is supposed to do because they pay for it. So my first example is the Kuali Foundation. This is a US nonprofit organization which develops the software that American universities need for their operation. So think course management, student management, fundraising, HR, etc., all of that. Their business is not software. These are universities. Their business is education. But there's no way of performing their business without good software. So they created Kuali a long time ago, 15, 16 years. And the universities are leading it, so it's user-led. They are also actually developing. Universities often have developers on staff, so they're also contributing to the actual software development. A second example here is openMDM. That's the automotive industry. openMDM stands for Open Measurement Data Management. If you're producing a car, a lot of test data is being created that shows your car was manufactured to exacting standards, fulfills all kinds of requirements, regulatory requirements, etc. So Audi, BMW, Mercedes, and other car companies decided that the software for that is not that they can purchase in the market, is not what they want. They wanted their own open source software because it fulfills their needs better. So they are leading the development, they are paying for it. And in this case, interestingly, even though they could, they're actually not participating in the actual development. They're only sponsoring the software development. Here an interesting twist is that the automotive suppliers, for reasons or concerns about liability, decided not to own the intellectual property that's being created, but rather leave the copyright with the consulting companies that they sponsor for the development of the open source software. A third example is a consortium, or an open source foundation that I helped create called openKONSEQUENZ. These are the local energy network, local energy distributors in Germany who manage the last kilometer of electricity and gas to your home. And they needed software for the smart grid, were not satisfied with closed source solutions, and decided to join forces and collaboratively develop the software for the smart grid that they need. So it's user-led. The energy companies pay for it. In this case, the energy companies, even though they employ a lot of engineers, it's not software developers, so they also don't develop the software themselves. So here we have 3 examples of industries, higher education, automotive, and energy, where the companies in these industries were so dissatisfied with the closed source software they could purchase that they decided the world would be a much better place for them if they joined forces and collaboratively sponsored the development of the open source software they need. Now, that's easier said than done. Let me first still explain the benefits or explain why this went the open source way. First of all, rather than just doing open source, you wanted the foundation to have a place to regulate any conflicts you might have, all of that. You simply wanted good governance. Otherwise, the CEOs of these companies would not pay for the development. You needed a structure, a governance body that regulated the interests and made sure it's open and fair and transparent to all parties. Open source foundations have the benefit of making things more long-lived, because now there's a legal body and you don't depend on individual people any longer. You also don't want a traditional consortium, because open source gives you ready blueprints that are much more likely to succeed than if your lawyers draw up their own solutions, etc. Open source licenses are not fully approved in court, but are much further along and are much more likely to be understood and have clear implications for everyone than a license your lawyers might invent. Same thing with the bylaws and governance rules, open source foundations. There are plenty of those that already exist. They will give you very clear rules that have been proved times and over in existing foundations. If you decided to draw up your completely own rules, the likelihood that there are problems with that is simply much higher than if you follow an open source foundation blueprint. So all of that has the purpose of making something that is hard, successfully developing software, much more likely to succeed. That's why you use the open source foundation blueprint. So I'm staying at the surface, if you will. There's a lot to say. We do a lot of research on how these open source user foundations can possibly work. Let me spend 2 more slides on that, though. The best perspective I have found of explaining it is that the purpose of an open source user foundation from the perspective of the users who create it, the members who set it up, is that they want to create their own ecosystem of suppliers playing by rules set up through the foundations. So you want to structure your ecosystem of suppliers rather than facing some suppliers who make their own rules. This is possible if you actually set up the open source foundation, if you create community open source that has no barriers to using it and providing products and services on top of it. It also means commercially that the members, and that is sometimes hard to swallow at first, that the members of the open source foundation who join in order to help get the software they need pay twice. First, they support or they sponsor the development of community open source software, but that software out of necessity is the same to everyone in the industry. There is nothing competitively differentiating because it's open source software, it's community, and so nobody gets a particular added commercial benefit as a user. You can only specialize or customize or get dedicated services for this community open source software if you pay a particular company then to provide that software to you in some consumable way to you as a service or as a packaged product. So you sponsor, you have to accept that you sponsor the development of the community open source, and that you also pay some company, usually, unless you have strong IT capabilities in-house, that you usually also pay for the provision of that a product or a service built on top of that community open source as you actually make it work for your organization. The key insight is that the combination of supporting community open source and paying for a final product, that the sum of these two costs is much lower than if you simply pay some closed source software company in the short term and in the long term. Because you avoid vendor lock-in, you avoid that component you depend on becomes a monopolist, etc. So I had to cut out anything I wanted to do specifically about the industries of highest interest here, I guess, since I need to close. But in our research, we found many aspects when it works well and when it may be challenging. So, for example, if we are working with the GIZ, some German charity, which is trying to help developing countries acquire software for single-payer healthcare systems. The problem is here, there's a country that's a user. So the number of users is limited. So what do? So it's not companies, for example, now that need to join forces, but this charity is trying to get countries to join forces to develop single-payer healthcare insurance software for their countries, and so forth. Right, I think I need to finish here. So summarizing, an open source foundation helps you manage your dependency on components. In particular, will it help you avoid a monopolist who will eat up all your own profits, making you produce and sell at zero profit, basically just scraping by. If you're not from the software industry, that's particularly important because software, as we saw, is eating up everything from inside. So interestingly enough, by using open source, you can take a lot of profit out of the software industry. It's a very interesting way of fighting back the budding dominance of software as a whole, but you need to acquire the abilities to at least manage a user foundation and manage the development of the software that you're interested in, that you need for your products to be competitive in the markets. I have some recommendations for public policy. I'm always very hopeful, but the main observation is that there's simply a lot of education to be done because companies still often don't realize their dependency on software and don't realize that they need to be active. They cannot be waiting passive. If software is that important component of your product, but you think you are producing cars and not software that rolls around on wheels, then you have to think again. You need to build up these abilities and face the software industry. And so that's a lot of education that countries can do, all the way to making it easier to establish specific user foundations that will address these particular issues for a particular country or company and industry within a country. All right, I'm at the end of my 30 minutes. Thank you very much for your time and attention.